Hey everybody, welcome back again. We're continuing with chapter 7 and we're looking at food production. We've covered some soil conservation methods, we looked a little bit at irrigation, and we talked about how wasteful this broadcast agricultural method of irrigation is and how much more efficient drip irrigation is. A lot of farmers have made this switch to drip. It requires effort and work and money in order to do that, but we need more farmers to stop using broadcast spraying. It's a pretty inefficient way to do it. And as water remains relatively cheap, well below its market value, there's not as much incentive to conserve. So I hope that changes in the future. All right, what I'd like to talk about in this video, continuing with chapter 7, is how we've been able to increase food production. In the last video, we looked at some figures where it showed that the population was increasing over time, but the food production was increasing over time. And of course, food insecurity was decreasing and malnutrition was also decreasing. So how is it possible that as human population increases, we're also increasing food production, right? Because as human population increases, more mouths to feed, but we're also occupying more of planet Earth with humans, human structures, and things that are related to living a human lifestyle, roads and markets and things like that, schools. And so how are we able to grow more food than ever, even though our population is increasing? Part of the way has to do with increasing the yields. This simple bar graph shows an increase in United States wheat yields over the decades. We are just growing more food than ever before. And the reason that we're able to do that is for a few reasons. Number one, back in the 1950s, we recognized that there was a host of things that plants needed in order to grow at their maximum genetic potential. And one of them is nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, things like that. And so we developed chemical fertilizers during the 1950s, applied them to our crops, and lo and behold, the plants grew bigger. Their yields increased. We had more food per unit area, say per acre or per hectare. So that was a big increase for us, a big push forward in food production. Also in the 1950s, we developed chemical pesticides, and these are poisons that kill pests, insects that would prey on the crops and diminish their yield. And so this was also an increase in food supply because as you killed the pests that ate your crops, there was more left for you. We also developed herbicides, and these are poisons that kill plants or kill weeds. And these are the things that are competing for all the resources that your crops need. So they're competing, the weeds are competing with your plants for water. The weeds are competing with your plants for sunlight. The weeds are competing with your plants for nutrients. And there's only so much to go around. So you really don't want the weeds in your crop area. So the herbicides that we've invented do a good job of taking those out. And then our crop yields go up, right? We don't have pests, we don't have weeds, and we don't have a lack of available nutrients anymore. So our yields are increasing. Selective breeding. So humans have been selectively breeding things since humans have been domesticating things, right? 10, 11,000 years ago, we started domesticating animals and we started selectively breeding those animals. And of course, once the agricultural revolution came around, we're selectively breeding as well. This is artificial selection. This is human beings, like we talked about in chapter 3. This is human beings selecting, I'm going to mate you with you, because if I'm growing strawberries and I want to mate a female plant and a male plant, right? Female genes and male genes, I want those to grow even bigger, sweeter strawberries. So we've been selecting what we breed, and this is not new. I want to point out that this is not genetic modification. There's a huge amount of misunderstanding here. Selective breeding is not about being in a lab with a microscope, tinkering with the species DNA and cutting and splicing and adding genes and removing genes. This is not selective breeding. We did this, 10,000 years ago. So this is not new. So for example, corn, right? We grow a lot of corn. Look at this. These are the ears of corn. This is the primitive native species that corn is based on. And look how tiny and really insignificant that little tiny corn ear is. And compared with the size of a modern ear of corn, this is enormous, what you find in the supermarket or the farmer's market, right? And how did we get them so big? Mother Nature didn't do that. We did that with selective breeding. So it works like this, pretty straightforward. Imagine, I'm going to move me. There we go. Imagine we have a crop of corn, right? And we know that each individual plant came from an individual seed and therefore has an individual set of genes. That the DNA for this one corn plant organism individual is going to be different than the DNA in that corn plant, right? So there's this natural variation that occurs from organism to organism. And we know that too. So natural variation is going to have some plants making larger ears of corn and smaller ears of corn. And so, of course, if I'm going to collect seeds for next year's crop, I'm not going to select them from the tiny guys. I want to select them from the biggest of the big. So I am selective in my breeding, right? Selective breeding, artificial selection. I'm going to plant those seeds in the ground for the next generation, and the desirable trait that I'm after, say, is just the size of the ear of corn. And over time, I do this again, and I do this again, and I do this again, and I do this again. And eventually, over time, the quality of my crop increases, the size of my ears of corn get bigger, or maybe I'm selecting for things like sweetness or sugar content, you name it. We can select for pretty much anything and shift the yields for us. Did it again. Sorry, guys. Okay. Selective breeding is artificial selection, right? It is not gene manipulation in the genetic modification sense of the term. These are different. So Mother Nature makes sunflowers, and then we make sunflowers. We selectively breed for bigger and bigger blossoms, and lo and behold, look what we get. Mother Nature makes strawberries, and then we make strawberries. We selectively breed for larger and larger and sweeter berries, and this is what we have. This top picture shows something that's almost hard to believe. In the middle here, we have a wild mustard. This is the original native species. And from this, we've selectively bred for different things. And we have created cauliflower. From this wild mustard, we've selectively bred for broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi. Right? And so that selective breeding process is pretty fruitful. Pun intended. Okay, let's switch gears now and stop talking about selective breeding and mention genetic modification. So let's talk about genetic modification. Genetic engineering, GE for short, or genetically engineered, is direct manipulation of an organism's genetic material. So these are its genes, right? This is its DNA molecule, and we're directly manipulating that. So by direct manipulation, we can add genes in, right, that we want to see in there that the plant currently doesn't have, or that the salmon currently doesn't have. We can delete genes from its DNA molecule, from its genome, if there's something in there we don't want it to express. Or we can swap. We can swap genes from individual to individual. We can swap genes from species to species, sometimes crossing the kingdom line as well. So that's genetic engineering. Recombinant DNA technology is really the technology that's used to do the engineering process. And recombinant is just a fancy word for recombining. So I'm combining genes from that individual, and I'm recombining them together. So we're combining genes from different sources. So we can combine them from different species, as in the case of the genetically modified salmon, which we'll talk about. That's actually 3 species of fish that are recombined into one new DNA molecule that serves that big, fast-growing salmon. So we can use this recombinant DNA technology. And this produces the end product, which is the genetically modified organism, whether it's a stalk of corn or a strawberry or a salmon. And this is our GMO. You might see that genetically modified organism. And this organism carries recombinant DNA that's been recombined, that's been altered. So I want to point out that although we don't have the time and the breadth in chapter 7 to talk about all the aspects of genetic modification, we use it a lot in the medical field. Genetically modifying organisms to produce certain products for us, namely like human insulin. You know, you probably know this, that we use E. coli bacteria to do this for us. We genetically engineer those E. coli genomes to produce and carry a gene that codes for human insulin. And they produce human insulin because we've inserted a gene that codes for the production of human insulin. So the bacteria live their normal bacterial lives, doing their bacterial day-to-day things. But their genes include now a gene for human insulin production, which they then just produce. And we harvest it from them and give it to our insulin-dependent diabetics. So there's a whole host of success stories in the medical field. I want to just mention, before we move forward, this figure here on the right. And this is kind of showing the end result, which is a genetically modified organism, say corn. We genetically modify a lot of corn in the United States. And this gives you a quick little glimpse at what that process looks like, just sort of a big overview. This is a bacterial cell here, a bacterium. And bacteria, like all living things, have DNA. So this is their single bacterial chromosome. They also have a circular entity, what's called a plasmid. And this plasmid makes it really useful to insert genes. So let's say I have a bacterial cell here, and I have a cell from another organism over there. Say a cell from a corn plant. And this is the corn's DNA. It's genetic material here. And let's say that this individual has a gene that I care about, that I like a lot. This is my gene of interest here, shown in red. And let's say that this gene of interest allows, let's say my corn plants to grow much closer together than they would otherwise like to do. That's one of the ways we engineer our corn, to allow it to grow really close to other corn plants, so we can squeeze in a bunch on a small piece of land. So I take that gene of interest, which allows my corn to grow close together, and I insert it into this plasmid. Imagine cutting something with scissors and taping it together. And that's basically what we're doing with restrictive enzymes, if you've heard of the CRISPR gene, that recombinant technology. So now I've got a plasmid, and I've also got a new entity in my plasmid, namely this gene of interest. This then goes back into my bacterium, so it can replicate and make lots of little itty-bitty bacterial cells, but they all carry that new gene of interest. And so that can be applied then to our new organism. So we are actually literally changing the genetic code. We're going inside the lab, and we're going inside the nucleus of the cell, and we're going inside the DNA molecule itself to do this genetic engineering. This is not selective breeding, right? We weren't doing this 1,000 years ago. This is pretty new. And so this is another tool in our toolbox of how we're producing more food, right? Genetically modified foods are not new in the world. The world's top producers of genetically modified crops, the United States is the leader of the pack here, for better or for worse, far and away ahead of other countries worldwide that are producing genetically modified food crops. Right? These numbers are actually a couple years old, so you'll have to forgive me. I imagine they're a little bit higher now. In the United States, 94% of our soy produced is genetically modified, 88% of our corn, 95% of our sugar beets, which is where a lot of our sugar comes from, and 90% of our cotton are all genetically modified to increase yield, to help with some aspect of the crop. One of the ways in which genetically modified plants help us is not just in volume of food produced, but nutritious content. This is golden rice, one of the first genetically modified foods. And you can see the grains of rice here. The white rice is the sort of normal wild version, the non-genetically modified, and the yellow rice is the golden rice. And of course, we call it that because it looks golden. Rice typically does not produce beta carotene. And so the gene for producing beta carotene was inserted into the rice DNA, and now the rice produces all the things it does in its little rice life, but it also produces beta carotene, which makes it look golden. Beta carotene helps fight vitamin A deficiency, and this is directly linked to childhood blindness. And so in a lot of developing countries around the world where people aren't getting enough vitamin A, if they just eat this golden rice instead, they're assured to get enough of that in their diet. And it's a really useful tool, and nobody can argue about preventing childhood blindness. Genetically modified foods, we modify corn for a lot of reasons. We mentioned so they could grow closer together, the ears are larger, and also we do it for pest resistance. This is one of the larger pests. It's small in size, but larger problem in the corn industry, and these weevils eat the corn. So on the left-hand side here, you can see corn that is not genetically modified, that's been damaged by pests, and the corn on the right has been genetically modified with genes from this organism, Bacillus thuringiensis. BT for short, B for the genus name of Bacillus, and T for the species name of thuringiensis. This is a soil bacterium, lives in the soil naturally, and it has, as part of its genetic makeup, the naturally occurring ability to kill pests. So it's kind of like a naturally occurring pesticide in the soil bacteria itself. So this would be our gene of interest, and we would remove that gene from the soil's DNA, and then we would insert it into the corn's DNA. And now the corn naturally produces, well, I shouldn't say naturally, but it is now genetically modified to produce that pesticide. So in that same way, we can produce plants with a host of properties that Mother Nature would not have given them. We can make plants tolerant to pests, maybe with this BT gene. We can make plants tolerant to heat, so we can get plants to grow in temperatures that are too hot, that would normally kill a plant or make it unproductive. We can make them resistant to cold and frost. Strawberries are notorious for this. They hate being cold. And so we can engineer them to grow in frosty conditions, drought, and even acidic soils. So there's a whole host of things that we can genetically modify our plants to be tolerant of or to be successful in a certain situation. Whoops, that is not where I wanted to go. We're still recording. Recorder is recording. Okay. Let's go back here. Welcome back. Okay. There we go. All right. Table 7.1 from your textbook. These are all genetically modified organisms. Golden rice is shown up here towards the top, and you can read a little bit more about this in your book. We modify cotton to increase its yield, decrease pesticide use. Papaya, alfalfa, salmon, sugar beets, potatoes. There's our BT corn, sunflowers, biotech soybeans. I want to talk a little bit about soybeans and what's referred to as Roundup Ready. Have you heard of Roundup? I bet you have. Roundup is a pesticide and an herbicide. Right? They produce both. This is a Monsanto company. Roundup is a great weed killer, and you can buy it everywhere. What it does is it kills plants by turning off an essential enzyme that the plant needs to photosynthesize. So effectively, the plant will starve to death because it won't be able to make its own food. Roundup Ready crops are crops that you can spray with Roundup, and the Roundup won't kill the crops, but it'll kill everything else. So, for example, imagine this is your farm, and you've got rows and rows of soybeans or sugar beets, and you have weeds. So you'd like to go out with your Roundup and spray the weeds. So you put a person out there in the field, and they put a backpack on with a little container, and they have a sprayer, and they spray all the weeds, right? You can't spray Roundup in a broadcast way like this picture is showing here, because of course the Roundup would kill the weeds, but the Roundup would kill your crops as well. So you'd have to hand apply the Roundup, which is time consuming and costly. Enter genetic modification. And soybeans and sugar beets have been genetically engineered to be resistant to Roundup, specifically to the effective ingredient, which is called glyphosate, that's in the Roundup. So we insert that gene of interest, being resistant to glyphosate, into the plant's DNA, and then it grows and does its thing, and it's now resistant to Roundup. So when you want to spray for weeds, you get to climb in your big mechanized machine. I don't even really know what to call this. Broadcast sprayer tractor thing, and spray everything with Roundup, and your plants won't die. So those are Roundup Ready crops. Can you think of a reason why we might want to be concerned about that? Everything has downsides, right? The upside is it's efficient and it's cheap. So we can grow lots of food with minimal labor, right? One person in a broadcast sprayer tractor thingy can take care of an enormous amount of property. But what's the downside? Well, one of the downsides is that we are now creating super weeds, if you want to call them that. Let's take a look at these pictures first. This shows a map of the United States in 2002. This is 2014, and the blue is sort of a qualitative scale showing glyphosate-resistant species. So now, when we spray glyphosate on everything, most of the things are going to die, right? Most of the weeds will die, but not all of the weeds will die. Some of them will be genetically lucky enough to have some certain ensemble of traits in their genes that allows them to withstand that, and they survive, and they become resistant to that, and they reproduce, and they pass on that resistance to their offspring, much in the same way that bacteria have become resistant to antibiotics. They survive, a handful of them survive, and they reproduce, and they pass on that resistance to their offspring, right? So we have glyphosate-resistant weeds, we have antibiotic-resistant bacteria now. And this is natural selection in action. It's no different. It's always happening all the time. And so we've produced some Roundup-resistant weeds. And they're growing quickly. You can kind of see down here, there were only a couple, maybe one species here in California and single species in these other states, where now you can see where we have multiple states that have glyphosate-resistant weeds and a whole lot more species as well. So then what do we use once all of our weeds are glyphosate-resistant? We have to come up with something else, right? Some other product with some other mode of action to kill those weeds. The other thing we should think about too is that with Roundup Ready plants, we're spraying everything. Right? We're not just spraying a couple of weeds here and a couple of weeds there. We're spraying heavily on the food product itself. And all of that, of course, a large portion of that anyway, goes to market with the crop and comes to you. And so there's a lot of pesticide and herbicide resistance and residue, I should say, residue on the stuff that we're eating now. And that's also a concern for obvious reasons, right? So some of the problems that are associated with genetic engineering are about resistant species and health effects. So are these genetically engineered products safe for human consumption? The Food and Drug Administration of the United States says yes, although we have no long-term studies available for us to refer to. Some of the other concerns we have are about the spread of genetically modified organisms out into the wild. So with regard to the salmon, which we'll talk about and you'll read about, what if some of those genetically modified salmon escape and make their way out into the wild populations? And now we're mixing genes, right? Larger fish outcompeting smaller fish for resources and contaminating that gene pool. For plants, we see the genetically modified pollen, because once the whole organism is genetically modified, every single cell is genetically modified, including the reproductive cells, like pollen, which is kind of like sperm for plants, the male genetic component. So there's an enormous amount of scientific literature documenting the spread of genetically modified pollen into the wild, where they're hybridizing. Genetically modified plants are hybridizing with wild relatives, and then of course those genes are now out there in the environment and it's impossible to bring them back. There's been a bit of a backlash against genetically modified organisms, more so in Europe than in the United States. And one of the main pushbacks against GMOs is labeling. So currently in the United States and in Canada, you don't need to label your foods as being genetically modified or as containing genetically modified organisms. So if you buy a box of cornflakes and they're not organic cornflakes, are you getting genetically modified corn? You betcha. Of course you are. Same with soy. And unless it says it's organic or it's part of a non-GMO project, where certain companies are refusing to use genetically modified organisms or products, and they will proudly portray that on their labels. Unless you're seeing that, chances are really good that you're getting that. So Californians wanted to know about the options for getting their foods labeled. And so on the ballot in 2012, gosh, has it really been 8 years now? It's been 8 years. There was a Right to Know campaign, and this was Proposition 37. You can see on the left, yes, we want to know. We support labeling genetically engineered food, just to put a label on it so that consumers could make an informed choice. No on 37, stop the deceptive food labeling scheme. There was a large campaign on both sides, and it failed. And that's a really interesting conversation as to why it failed. There's a whole lot of money being thrown at this, a lot of misinformation in the advertising. One of the things, okay, I just have to tell you this, one of the things that really just fried me was when this campaign was going on and I'd watch the commercials that would come on TV and stuff, and they would talk about why we don't want to label, why you should vote no on Prop 37. Oftentimes it came down to this. They would say, genetically modified organisms, this is nothing new. We've been doing this since we've been growing crops. And they would talk about how we've been, genetically modifying corn for thousands of years. That's not genetic modification. What is that? What would that be? A couple thousand years ago, what were we doing? Were we modifying our crops? Were we changing them? You bet we were. But what were we doing? Right, we weren't genetically modifying them. We were just using artificial selection to select who we wanted to grow to produce our next year's crop. So there's a lot of misinformation, intentional or unintentional, in that campaign. And so this is one of my topics, I think, in our course is really that I really want to make sure that we come away from understanding is that we genetically modify a lot of our food. And in the United States, the laws are such that food manufacturers are not required to tell you that. So either you buy organic or you buy a product that states non-GMO. You're probably getting genetically modified, but you don't know. And so I find that really troubling. Not so much that I'm against GMOs, because there's a place for that. What I am against is the lack of information. Just tell me what's in my food product. Just tell me where this fish comes from. Just tell me where this chicken comes from and what I'm buying and what I'm eating, and then I can make my own choice about what I want to eat. And right now in this nation, we don't have a good sense of that. So, okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.